pessoal, boa tarde. Bem-vindos e bem-vindas aí a mais um painel da 5ª Conferência de Jornalismo de Dados e Métodos Digitais, né, do Coda.Br, aí já para os íntimos. Eu sou a Natália Mazotte, eu sou cofundadora da Escola de Dados e vou estar aqui com vocês moderando esse painel, tá, que se chama Investigação Online com Fontes Abertas, encontrando a verdade em um mundo pós-verdade. E quem vai ser a estrela desse painel aqui com a gente é o Eliot Higgins. Tá? O Elliot é fundador e presidente-executivo do Bellingcat, que é um coletivo de jornalismo investigativo, do qual eu sou muito fã, né? Eles fazem um trabalho incrível aí de descobrir delitos em todo o mundo, né? Esse trabalho ele começou em 2014 na Holanda, e hoje o Bellingcat já conta com 18 funcionários e mais de 30 colaboradores em todo o mundo. Eles têm uma comunidade crescente aí de pessoas que fazem esse tipo de investigação que ele vai explicar para a gente hoje, tá? Eles são pioneiros no que a gente chama de jornalismo de fontes abertas, né? Com um tipo de pesquisa forense de dados que são disponíveis, estão disponíveis na internet, né? Disponíveis publicamente, e um tipo de análise que eles chamam de análise cidadã-jornalística, né? Que usa técnicas como geolocalização e outras, que ele vai contar um pouco para a gente, para apontar localizações exatas por meio de imagens de satélite, para, enfim, corroborar ou refutar algumas afirmações que a gente vê online, tá? Antes de passar a palavra para o Elliot, né, a gente vai ver um vídeo de apresentação dele, eu queria agradecer aí os participantes, né, mais ativos do Coda, que, enfim, apoiaram e são parceiros nossos já há bastante tempo, né? Primeiro a Abrage, e que já conta, a gente já conta com a parceira da Brage já desde o primeiro Coda, o consórcio R, a IVOS, a Embaixada e o Consulado dos Estados Unidos, o Instituto Brasileiro de Pesquisa e Análise de Dados, a Embaixada do Reino dos Países Baixos, que, em especial, apoiou o workshop e a apresentação do Bellingcat nessa edição do Coda, e, por fim, o nosso parceiro aí de realização do Coda mesmo, que é o Google News Initiative. Tá? Então, agora a gente vai passar para a apresentação do Elliot e depois, ao final do vídeo, a gente vai ter um tempinho aí de perguntas e respostas, então já podem ir preparando as perguntas que vocês tiverem para ele. Vamos lá.
Hi, I'm Eliot Higgins. I'm the founder of Bellingcat and the executive director. Bellingcat is an online open source investigation collaborative. That means we use open source material to investigate a whole range of material and different kinds of sources for our investigations that cover a whole range of topics. As you can see here, we've done a lot in particular on the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 in Ukraine in 2014, the use of chemical agents in the Syrian conflict, a lot on the various attempts by Russia to assassinate its critics, and a whole range of different topics beyond that. But what I'm talking to you about today is how we do online open source investigation and what that actually is. So it's a 3-step process where we first identify information, we verify it, and amplify. So identification could be stuff like finding social media posts, searching through databases, just looking for anything that's available online. We also then verify it. Now, verification is actually making sure this stuff is actually true. That's often about cross-referencing it against other material. One thing that really has allowed us to identify stuff and verify stuff is basically the vast amount of information that's now available online. So what I'm talking about there is from about 2007 onwards, with the iPhone being launched and the kind of rise of the smartphone, and the impact that had on the rise on social media and how much information was being shared kind of in the immediate moment because people had this computer in their pocket where they could share stuff online immediately it meant there was a huge amount of information coming from incidents from across the world, from people's lives that we could investigate. Now we can verify that by using other sources, for example, Google Earth satellite imagery, something that also became more available in the last 10 years or so. There's other references we can use as well. Google Street View, for example, videos that have been filmed or photographs taken that are shared online, geotagged locations. So the old site Panoramio was very good for that, but there's other sites available for that now. So by using all these combined sources and verifying them, we then have reliable information we can then amplify in various ways. Now, the amplification stage could be writing an article about it, doing a documentary, a podcast, even submitting documents to a court or legal process. It's really taking what we verified and using it to the best, that it can be used for. But I started doing this kind of work about 9 years ago, just as a hobby. It was something I was doing in my spare time. And one of the first things I was looking at was the conflict in Libya, because the Arab Spring, which the Libyan conflict was part of, was really the first time we really saw a lot of information coming from conflict zones in particular that could tell us more about what was happening. And at that time, I was working in a completely different field. I was just doing administration and finance for a company that housed asylum seekers. It was nothing to do with investigation. But I had an interest in world events, and it was interesting to me that you could find out more about what was going on than was being published in the press. And I was interested in the finer details of what's happening, like, where are these forces positioned? How are the front lines changing? And there was only so much information in the mainstream media, but if you looked on social media and what was being shared, there were videos that were telling a different story or giving more information. So one of the first videos I geolocated was this one from TG in Libya. Now, geolocation is confirming the location where video was or photograph was taken using details in the actual document itself. So I'll take you through that process. This is a video that was shared online by rebels in Libya. It's from the town of TG in Libya, and it shows what they claim to be the town they've captured. Now, this was quite important at the time because this front line had been very stable for weeks and weeks, and all of a sudden they'd pushed out and captured this town. So there was a lot of debate online about whether this was true or not. The pro-Gaddafi supporters said, no, this couldn't possibly be true, but the video evidence seems to say something different. But how do we actually know this is filmed in TG in Libya? Well, this is kind of the process we do with a lot of the stuff we verify, where first we start thinking, okay, how do you narrow down on this target location? Where we start looking at details in the landscape, larger details as well, because what we're going to do is look at satellite imagery of the area and then figure out exactly where this is. So here we have a large building. It's a mosque with a dome and a minaret. And it's next to our next clue, which is a large main road with 2 lanes of traffic and a divider in the middle. So you can go to Google Maps, Google Earth, and actually find the location. Here you can see a road running through the center of town, so we focus on that first, and it has 2 lanes of traffic. So there's a good chance we might find what we're looking for here, and we travel down the road until eventually we come across a mosque with a dome and the minaret. And because of the position of the dome and the minaret, we can get a position for the camera, because we can tell that if the minaret is on the left-hand side and the dome is on the right-hand side, as we can see in the video, then the camera position must be just to the southeast of it, positioned on the road. And of course that makes sense because we can see in the video they're stood on the edge of the road. But once we have these larger details, we can start narrowing down to smaller and smaller details. So we look at, okay, we can see the wall that's visible there that's casting a shadow in the satellite imagery. We can see the utility poles. You can just make those out also casting shadows. And the whole process is really using the kind of larger details to start narrowing down on the locations and then looking for the smaller details and making sure they match. But Google Earth is a very useful tool for us, but it's not just about the satellite imagery they provide. The Caesar photographs is another thing we looked into at Syria, where basically someone working for the Syrian government who was documenting basically the victims of their torture program. The kind of bureaucracy required them to document all the corpses with details of who they were and other information. He basically took thousands of photographs and then escaped Syria and gave them to authorities abroad. So these photographs have become quite famous, and they show mostly corpses with signs of torture. They're really horrific. The people have been starved, really terrible imagery. But what that doesn't really tell us is where they were taken, because often it's bodies lying on the ground and it's just a picture of the floor. And you can't really do much with a picture of the floor to geolocate something. But there was one photograph that was published, and it showed corpses, which I've removed here, but it showed a background, which is the most important thing. We knew from the person who escaped and leaked these photographs that he claimed he had been working in a few different locations to take these photographs. So already we had a clue of the few locations it could possibly be. He said it was inside Damascus, and he listed a few locations. And so we assume that this photograph is somewhere in Damascus, but how do we know where? Well, what's important is this mountain in the distance. This is a known landmark in Damascus, and these two very faint lines are two aerials that are actually on top of this hill. So now if we go into Google Earth, we can actually place the camera at one of the locations he was taking these photographs, and then use 3D terrain view on Google Earth to actually look at the same mountain. And what I did here is, once I found the mountain, I went to the satellite imagery and put 3D models on top of the locations of those two antennae. And then when you compare this image with the photograph, they're in very similar positions. Now, Google Earth is a three-dimensional model of basically terrain. It doesn't show buildings unless those models have been added manually in many cases. There is now some scanning that's being done, which helps a lot. But in Damascus, you don't have that. So you don't have the buildings, you don't have the trees that are visible, but you can see the landscape is very, very similar. So we then start narrowing down on this location and start doing something that's very common in open source investigation, which is drawing colored boxes around everything. So the process here is basically showing that the photograph matches the details in the terrain. So each of these colored boxes and circles match to a particular item in the satellite imagery. And as you can see here, there's many, many different matches that help us confirm the exact location, which confirms these photographs were taken in Damascus. Not only that, but we can see other details. So that's the location where the photographs were taken, and just to the north is this location. And this is the presidential palace of President Assad. And we can actually measure the distance between where these corpses were being documented and the presidential palace, and show it's just over 500 meters. So it's almost happening under his nose. There's other stuff that was coming through social media as well from Syria. At this point, around 2012, I had started collecting all the YouTube channels used by Syrian opposition groups, be they military groups, media centers, or other kinds of groups. Because what happened quite quickly with Syria is it became quite systemized. Rather than having lots of people on social media posting from rebel-held areas, generally it was quite a small number of people and quite a rising number of media centers and just YouTube channels, basically, where every video from a certain location was being posted, which meant you could go through those videos every single day and find new things that were happening. And that's what I started doing. And in this example, it's one of the first videos ever of something called a barrel bomb. A barrel bomb is an improvised explosive device. It is basically filled with explosives and shrapnel and then pushed out a helicopter with a fuse in it, sometimes something like a wick fuse, sometimes an impact fuse. But these very early examples, and this is one of the first videos ever, looked like someone had pushed over a bin. So there was a lot of kind of cynicism about what these things actually were. So we had the likes of Russia Today posting articles, barrel bomb baloney, claiming this was completely insane, that the Syrian government would use such things. But as I started looking through the videos every single day, there were more and more videos showing helicopters and aircraft attacking various locations inside Syria. And this is one of the first videos I came across where you can actually see a barrel bomb being pushed out of the back of a HIP transport helicopter, which you can just make out here. Of course, you still get people saying, well, this is very blurry and it could be CGI and blah, blah, blah. But then you get videos like this actually filmed inside the back of a HIP transport helicopter, where you have someone lighting a fuse on the back of a barrel bomb and then pushing it out the back of a helicopter. This is pretty hard to deny, but people still did deny this because they said, well, this could be anywhere in the world. This is, maybe a sound stage in Qatar using Hollywood special effects and all kinds of claims. But apart from the more fanciful claims, we still want to geolocate this video. And in fact, we can geolocate this video because of what's visible. Because we have a top-down view of the town they're dropping this bomb on, we can use another top-down view on Google Earth again. We can search for the various villages in the location and zoom in to the correct one. It wasn't this quick in real life, but we can then compare the two. We can look at the road layout, the layout of the buildings, and show that there's a very strong match between the two. And these different kinds of open source investigation techniques, or these geolocation techniques, are all kind of like a toolbox we use when we're trying to do different kinds of investigations. Now, this particular technique was then used in a further investigation about Russia's bombing of Syria in 2015. It started in September 30th, and Russia claimed that at that time they were targeting ISIS. Only ISIS, that's the only people they were bombing. And there were a lot of claims that no, actually they weren't bombing ISIS, that the people on the ground were saying that Russian aircraft were now bombing all kinds of non-ISIS territory, including civilian infrastructure. But the Russians denied that. Because Sergei Lavrov saying, do not listen to the Pentagon about Russian airstrikes, ask the Russian Defense Ministry. And in a way, that's something we could do, because the Russian Ministry of Defense started posting videos like this on their YouTube channel, claiming to show ISIS facilities being bombed in Syria. And initially, these descriptions were quite precise, because they would say things like, this is a ISIS facility 20 kilometers outside of Raqqa to the southeast. So that would, if these were accurate, would help us narrow down where they actually were. Now, something that's quite powerful in the work that Bellingcat does is we have a community around us who are very engaged with investigating. So a small group of people on Twitter who knew our work and started seeing these videos decided to start geolocating every single video. And they geolocated 30 videos from Russia claiming to be bombing ISIS. And they did the same thing that we did with the barrel bomb thing, spot the difference between Google Earth and the video footage. And they identified that only one of these videos was actually filmed in ISIS territory. The rest was outside of that territory. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do we know what ISIS territory is and what isn't? Well, again, we looked at the Russian Ministry of Defense and what they were saying, because they are the ones making these claims. And they rather helpfully provided this map to us. And this is a map showing the areas of control in Syria based off the Russians' own claims. So we can compare the videos to what's on these maps. And we can actually take this map, there was a digital copy available online, and we inserted it into Google Earth as an overlay. And then we basically sketched around the edges of it and removed the original digital image, leaving us with these very useful areas marked off. So the green areas in the west around Aleppo, those are non-ISIS rebels. So these are the people that Russia said they aren't claiming bombing. So to the north, we have the orange areas, which are Kurdish-held areas, and then we have the area in black, which is the ISIS-held areas. So here's an example of one of the geolocations that was done. This was claimed by Russia to be an ISIS facility being bombed. So you would assume that this is in ISIS territory. Well, it was geolocated, and what we discovered was, in fact, it was geolocated to this location in the territory that Russia said was not ISIS territory. We not only discovered that this was not ISIS territory, and obviously not an ISIS facility, but it was also a bakery being run by the charity, the IHH. And what was really surprising about these videos that Russia was sharing is it showed them bombing civilian infrastructure. There were bakeries bombed, there were grain silos bombed, there were water treatment plants bombed. So in a way, Russia was providing the evidence of their own war crimes. But we'll come back to Russia later, but there's other ways crowdsourcing and geolocation can be used. So ISIS decided to have a social media campaign to promote an upcoming speech by one of the senior members of ISIS. And they asked their followers to take photographs of themselves holding a piece of paper up to the camera with a hashtag on in Arabic promoting this upcoming speech. And these are some of the photographs. So these started appearing first on Telegram, on ISIS Telegram channels. And with ISIS Telegram channels, half the people on there are journalists and researchers looking for what ISIS is sharing. So they then start sharing it on Twitter and social media. And these are some of the photographs that started appearing online. They appeared in my timeline, and I started looking at them thinking if they could be geolocated. Now, the one on the left-hand side, no way you're going to be able to geolocate that. It's just some leaves. It could be literally anywhere in the world. The one in the middle, it's inside a shop. Now, if you knew every single shop in every single city in every town, then maybe you'd be able to do that, but it's just not going to be possible. But this one on the right-hand side, it's possible to geolocate it. He's telling us it's in Germany, it's in Munster, and for the moment, we'll assume he's telling the truth. So how do we actually geolocate this? Well, there's some good details here. You may have already seen there's traffic lights in the background, which suggests there's a junction. You can also see a bus. So some people thought, well, maybe there's a bus route you can find. But the thing here that was actually most useful was the advertising pole that's on the left-hand side. Because in Russia, they're very organized. Sorry, in Germany, they're very organized. I'll get back to Russia later. And they have these lovely websites where they list the various places where there's advertising poles and other advertising areas. So you can actually search by advertising poles and then get a map of everything you can find. Now, this is one thing we try and do with these kind of geolocations. It's not always just about the obvious tools like Google Earth, but kind of the more obscure websites and kind of stuff you may never have thought of. There's sites that track marine traffic, air traffic. You can search for people who are plane spotters who are collecting information on the ground, all kinds of weird and wonderful sources. So what we were able to find here were these images of us locations of these poles, and Munster has some really good high resolution imagery on it because these are aerial photographs, not satellite photographs, which tend to be lower resolution. And we can look for all these individual locations, like the one on the top left, and say, okay, can we see a junction there because we have the traffic lights? No, they're not there. But one of them does have traffic lights and a junction. And if we look there, we can figure out the position of the camera to begin with. We can tell in the photograph he's on the pavement with a pole near him looking towards the traffic lights of the junction. So this is the view he seems to be having. So does the details, the smaller details that we're narrowing onto, have a match? And first of all, we can see there's obviously the advertising pole there, but behind that, you can see these metal railings. Behind that, you can see these road markings. And important here is that the thick road marking is on the left and the dotted one is on the right, which confirms the camera position is correct. We then have other details like the 2 traffic lights that are visible and so on and so forth. Now, this was something that again was crowdsourced. I asked my followers if they could figure out where these photographs were taken, and there were 4 I shared in total that I thought could be geolocated. Out of the 4, 3 of them were geolocated in 10 minutes. One of them took an hour, but that's because the person who shared it gave me inaccurate information about where they were, but it still only took an hour. So crowdsourcing can be an extremely powerful tool. And when we found these locations, some of these people had taken the photographs from their own homes or from out of buildings. And being ISIS supporters, it was kind of our duty to report them to the local police, and they were followed up. Some of them were actually charged with terrorism-related offences because of what the police discovered in their investigations of these people. So, by sharing this information online, the social media campaign that was meant to promote, this speech became a big story about these dumb ISIS supporters who give away their positions to the world by posting photographs online. So it's not just about proving something or debunking something. It can actually change the media narrative around something as well, and that can be very important, especially when you start dealing with things like disinformation. Something else we do with Bellingcat is we help other organisations with what they're doing, and one of them is the Europol Stop Child Abuse, Trace and Object campaign. So Europol started this campaign, and we kind of stumbled across it as they just started it. They've just got a small number of followers on their Twitter account, and I thought, well, we can boost this. And what we were boosting were images that they had taken from abuse imagery, and they were asking people, what are these items? So there's shopping bags, toys, items of clothing, and we amplified that campaign to our network, the people who follow us on social media, and that found a lot of results. We were able, with that crowdsourced investigation, to find lots of these results, but some of them are quite remarkable what people were able to find. This is one of the examples where instead of an object, they show an entire photograph with blurred out individuals in it, but they were asking, where is this taken? This could be any room in any building anywhere in the world. It could be a private bedroom, it could be a hotel, we just didn't know. This is all the information we had, this photograph. Within a very short amount of time after we shared this, and it was shared through social media and on places like Reddit as well, had a subreddit that were getting involved with this. Someone said, I've stayed here. I've stayed in this hotel, and it's in Mauritius, and this is the name of the hotel. So we went to the hotel website and started looking through the photographs of the bedrooms, and we found this photograph. And even though the bed sheets have changed and some of the decoration is a bit different, it clearly is the same hotel room, if not, the same, a copy of the same hotel room as you often find in hotel rooms, if not the very same one. So the police were then able to go to that hotel and find out who was staying in that particular room with those red bed sheets when, they had those red bed sheets, because it also helps us date the photograph as well, but the changes in the bed sheets. So this also was a significant help for that investigation. Another example is these photographs. Europol tweeted this out. They had a couple of photographs. It was partly blurred out, and it was a rooftop somewhere in Asia. Now, Asia is a very big place, so how do we figure out where this is? Again, we crowdsourced it, and there are some very dedicated people who will spend weeks and weeks and weeks looking into these. And in this case, a Finnish Twitter user, Oliani, used his time over 2 weeks to figure out exactly where it was taken. And he quickly threw these notes together and sent them off to Europol. And we followed that up, and we found more photographs from the ground of the buildings around that location. And that allowed us to match the buildings around that building, as you can see on the left-hand side, to specific buildings. And then on the right-hand side, we have a photograph of the specific building and the specific rooftop from where that photograph was taken. Something else we were then able to do is start dating the photographs, because what we discovered is in the more recent photographs, they'd put up mobile phone masts on a lot of these buildings. So it allowed us to start dating when this photograph could have been taken. And geolocation and chronolocation, as we like to call it, it's a fancy term, but it just means figuring out where something was taken and when it was taken, is very, very useful for verifying content. We can do it more than just, we can also help out in different ways. This is a case where a BBC journalist that we had previously changed asked on social media if we could help find a family that had gone missing in the British Virgin Islands. So this family had just moved to the British Virgin Islands from the UK. They hadn't provided their address to any of their family members. And just as they arrived, they filmed this video that showed Hurricane Irma hitting the island. And there's really not much to see at the moment. It was just as it was heading in. But this is all the evidence we had to where they could be. And at first glance, there's really not much there. But from this very short video clip, we're able to find exactly where they were. So the first thing that really stood out were these islands in the distance. Now, if you think back to the example with the Caesar photographs, you can remember that we can use Google Earth Terrain View. And this is what people did. We shared this on social media again, and people started moving around the outside of the island, looking outwards, looking for a view that matched. And in one stretch of road, we found this view. And this view is a very strong match to what we could see in that video, but we wanted something a little bit more solid than that. We wanted a photograph if we could. Now there's various tools we can use, and this is one called EchoSec that allows you to search for geotagged social media posts. And in this case, I searched around that area of the road and found one geotagged right on the road looking out to those islands, which was a very, very clear view of these islands. And I was able to get a very high resolution version of it, and you can see it here, and we can compare it to what's visible in the video. So if you look at the shape of those islands, you can see that there's a very strong match there. So that was our first clue that this is likely the location we're talking about. And people went around the whole island looking for spots where it could be, and they just couldn't find another spot that matched this well. But it's still a large area, and we know it's not filmed from the road because they're obviously inside or just outside some sort of structure. And I assumed, okay, this must be a residential property because they're a family. We don't really have a reason to think they would be out shopping or in an industrial area. So we start looking for other clues. We have this kind of wedge shape on the roof. We have this wooden banister as well. And I start looking then at the satellite imagery of the area and the 3 locations I think it could be where there's structures. So in the west, we had this place called Potwood Pond, which was an industrial estate. So that was definitely not going to be it. To the east, this residential area has boats in front of it, so no. But this area in the middle called Havers seemed to be the best location it could possibly be, because we could see residential houses, there are cars in the driveway, swimming pools, those kind of things. The question is then, how do we get photographs of these houses? How do we get a photograph that can actually match to what we're seeing in this video? Well, there's other sources of imagery online, particularly of houses. There weren't any Instagram posts tagged here, there weren't any street view imagery, but there were Airbnb and estate agent listings. So I went through every single estate agent's listing and every Airbnb and every possible website that has photographs of houses I could find. And I found this house. And there's photographs that are listed on the website. There's 15 of them in total. And this is one of the photographs. It's a view out to sea. And you can see the banisters are a very similar design. And that was important because having looked through a lot of these different properties, all of them had different designs of how they were built. They had different railings, they had different roof designs. You can see here the edge of the roof at this building, and you can see this same wedge shape. And that was something that was very unique. I hadn't seen that in any other house, anything close to that. But I kept looking through these photographs and they had all the lovely views out to sea, but those views out to sea just weren't the same as the one I had in the video because it was blocked. You just didn't have that clear view. So I was thinking, well, all these buildings are unique. Every single house I've looked at so far is unique. So I went back to the satellite imagery. And the house on the left is the one that was being sold. But then I realized the house on the right, apart from the swimming pool and the outbuilding, has exactly the same roof structure. It's a different color, but the roof is exactly the same. And it was the only house in the entire area that matched to another house. So I called up the estate agent who sold the house on the left-hand side, and he said, yes, he had actually sold the house on the right-hand side to a British family who had just moved in there and then was evacuated. And this was the family that had gone missing. And thanks to that, we were then able to get the estate agent to get us in contact directly with the missing family and get them in contact with their family back in the UK who are still wondering where they were. And that took about all of an hour to do. So you can actually do something like this, even using a tiny amount of information, very, very rapidly indeed. Now, we also do a lot on, as you already have seen, on Russia, but that involves us dealing with a lot of misinformation and disinformation because Russia generates quite a bit of that. But it also means we have a community around us who see this. And in a way, by dealing with disinformation and addressing it, you can sort of almost inoculate them against disinformation. So I'm going to use this example of probably one of the worst pieces of disinformation I've seen in my life. So Russia, they started a social media campaign and they posted these 4 images on their Facebook site in Russian, Arabic and English, on Twitter in the same languages and other social media sites, claiming that the Russian MOD shows irrefutable evidence that the US are actually covering ISIS combat units to recover their combat capabilities, redeploy and use them to promote American interests in the Middle East. So they're saying that the US is working with ISIS, which is a huge and damning allegation. And what they've got drone imagery. And they posted it in English, they posted it in Russian, they posted it in multiple languages. But this image stood out to me. So this ISIS automobile convoy leaves Abu Kamal for Syrian-Iraqi border on November 9th, 2017. Very precise information. The problem is I saw this and it kind of leapt out to me a bit because it reminded me of something I'd seen a couple of weeks earlier, posted by an Indian journalist. So this Indian journalist said this was live drone action over Mosul. Attached video is of an ISIS convoy trying to resupply fighters in Mosul and being taken out by a Predator drone. So 2 completely different stories about what seemed to be the same image. And at the time, 2 weeks ago, prior to the Russian post, I'd looked at this and I noticed something very odd about this video. I watched the video and I noticed a couple of odd things. One was in the bottom right hand corner, a big red fire button. Top right corner, development footage, this is a work in process, all content subject to change. And the way the explosions were clipping through the vehicles, the way that the people on the ground weren't running around very realistically. The whole thing was a computer game. This is a video from a computer game. And I thought, okay, this looks like it might be one of those kind of AC-130 videos that you see in computer games nowadays. And I Googled that, and the first result was this: AC-130 gunship simulator, convoy engagement. So at the time, I tweeted this, and this is where the Russian screenshot was from. Russia had used a computer game screenshot for irrefutable evidence the US was helping ISIS. Completely insane. But 2 weeks earlier, I'd posted this. I'd said 10,000 retweets, and it's from a computer game. And the kind of people who follow me on social media are the kind of people who also follow the Russian Ministry of Defense. So I posted an article about this, wrote about it at Bellingcat. lots of details. And then we had a reaction to the Russian post. Now, because Russia had posted this and the people following me already knew this was, basically from a computer game, they reacted immediately with screenshots of the computer game, links to the YouTube video, everything like that. And it was really embarrassing for Russia. So people started even mocking them openly, using this screenshot of American tanks defending ISIS in Syria. And it was humiliating for Russia. Global media, BBC, The Sun, even further abroad in the foreign language press, just couldn't believe it. The Russia claims US is helping ISIS using video games as evidence. It had a kind of a mainstream press appeal. It also had crossover specialized press appeal in the technical press as well. This is also a rare example where sites like Russia Today, Russian-funded state media, even did articles about it and even posted photographs showing or screenshots from people posting about it. And it was actually the only time I've ever seen the Russian Ministry of Defense retract a claim like this. And it was because there was this kind of inoculation in the kind of social media ecosystem against this particular piece of disinformation because it had already previously been discussed. I mean, they claimed that it was down to a civilian employee attaching the wrong images, but that's obviously complete nonsense. It's madness. Because why would you take the time of carefully cropping images from a computer game in a big social media campaign? The other 3 images were actually from US footage of the Iraq war, which was also later found online. So all 4 of those images were completely fabricated. Russia posted 4 new drone images with the same claims that were blurry and completely impossible to see what they were. So it literally could have been anywhere in the world. But by that point, it didn't matter because people were mocking them for what they were doing. And even now, a few years later, anytime Russia shares drone imagery, you have people referring to that incident. So that's the work of Bellingcat. It's a whole range of different things we do. And I hope you enjoy that. And I'm looking forward to our Q&A later. Thank you.
Okay, we are back here. I was on mute. Now I'm going to talk in English to make the conversation with Elliot more fluid, but the simultaneous translation will continue. So hi, Elliot.
Hi.
Thanks for this very inspiring presentation, and thanks for being with us. It's a great pleasure to have you in this conference. And I've been following the work of Bellingcat for a while. I'm a big fan, and I'm always impressed by the level of complexity and sophistication that you apply in your investigations. And I've been following your work since your first investigations around the war in Syria. And my first question for you goes in this direction and rely on this huge experience that you have in this topic. So how have open source investigations changed since you started the work with Bellingcat?
I kind of really see the development of online open source investigation as a kind of almost 4 stages, really. I think the first stage really began in 2007 when Apple released the iPhone, and we started seeing an increase of people using smartphones and more apps, and that led to more social media being used, so more people sharing information about their lives. Then in parallel to that, we also saw things like Google Earth, Google Street View, and other sources of imagery being kind of more accessible. So all of a sudden you had all this information from people on the ground and all this information like satellite imagery that was really important for doing things like geolocation. But it wasn't until 2011 with the start of the Arab Spring when you really started seeing it moving from social media being used by media organizations to ask people what kind of weird weather and weird stuff they're seeing to conflict being analyzed. And that's kind of why I started doing my work, first looking at Libya and then later Syria. And that kind of period was defined by, I think, more kind of human rights organizations, media organizations, very focused on particular areas, in particular the conflict in Syria, becoming interested in open source investigation through kind of seeing the work I was doing. Then that kind of led to, for example, the August 21st, 2013 sarin attacks, which was a kind of big moment for open source evidence, because we could see the victims, we could see the chemical weapons that were used, we could see those chemical weapons had been used in previous attacks in Syria, while the kind of more mainstream media just didn't have any information coming from the ground. It was all open source information that told us what was happening. And there was also kind of a moment where you had the veteran journalist Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize winner, publishing a story about the attack, which was clearly contradicted by the open source evidence. And that kind of was a moment where kind of it was seen by, I think, some journalists and human rights type people who had followed this as old journalism versus new journalism. I prefer not to see it like that. I see open source investigation as something that can enhance journalism rather than kind of be a versus kind of a thing. But that was quite a big moment. And then 2014 was the third stage where you had the downing of MH17. And I think that's where you started seeing the kind of governments and kind of more journalists, and it had kind of a broadening and appeal to different kinds of fields. And with the downing of MH17, the aircraft that was shot down Malaysia Airlines by Russian forces in eastern Ukraine, that was the first time you also had in parallel to what Bellingcat was doing, a criminal investigation going on as well. So we did kind of 2 years of work on it, revealed all this information, and then the criminal investigation came along and basically said the same thing. And I think it was really in that moment around 2016 to 17 where we saw this fourth stage now, where there's a movement to saying, how do we use this open source information as evidence for justice and accountability? Something I was doing on my blog, so something that's now considered, you know, by the ICC as a potential source of evidence for the cases they're working on.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I wonder if you could explain us a little bit more about your background and how you taught yourself this variety of sophisticated techniques to debunk some of the most harmful claims that we have from governments and on the internet. How did you start this work?
So I started this just, I had no background in investigation. I was actually working in various administration and finance roles for various companies, but I just had an interest in kind of politics, especially with a US focus, and the US had interest in the Middle East. And I was kind of grew up during the first Gulf War, and then, you know, the 2003 invasion of Iraq was also a kind of big moment for me in a kind of political and my sense of the world, and also the sense of how countries, you know, the US and the UK basically lied to build a case for war. And that kind of, I was kind of the person who would read kind of Noam Chomsky and Naomi Klein, that very kind of leftist literature. And that kind of informed kind of myself and my interests. And then when it came to the Arab Spring, I also was someone who spent a lot of time on the internet. So I was seeing a lot of this coming through, and I was frustrated that the mainstream media wasn't looking at this stuff, or if it did, it was always like heavily caveated, saying we don't know if this is true, we don't know if this is real, you know. So what seemed like really interesting information was being ignored. So I thought, how, you know, like I did with the first video I showed you, how do I figure that out? And it kind of just started from there. But that was really more about arguing with people on the internet, and like someone saying, oh, that's not filmed there. And me thinking, well, let's see if we can find out. And then over time, I kind of built all these kind of different skills, you know, geolocation, doing it in different ways. And it's almost as if you build a kind of toolbox of different, you know, processes and skills that when you face a new problem, you know, with those kind of experience under your belt, you say, okay, I've encountered something like this before, and this is how I fixed it, or I know this tool that can be used to make it much more easier to figure out where this stuff is. So you kind of see the, I guess, the flow chart of the investigation in your mind, and then you just start moving through it in the most efficient manner possible, knowing that if one method or one tool doesn't work, there's alternative ones you can use.
Okay, and as far as I know, a huge part of these investigations come from some of the tools that we have available around geolocation and social networks. And now I've seen more recently a growing tension between privacy and more restrictive access to data, especially from social networks. and this necessity, this need to kind of rely on this data and on different kind of tools and different kind of social networks to get the information to debunk misinformation that we see growing around. So how do you see and how do you adapt your techniques and methodologies to deal with this tension?
I think in one sense, the kind of early period, I would say that second stage I was talking about was almost a golden period for open source investigation, because this is before the social media companies started figuring out our tricks or reacting to the tricks of the people like Cambridge Analytica and stuff like that. So we could find a lot more information, but it was kind of, I think, part of the natural evolution of the internet and social media that these restrictions would appear because of the way they were being abused, by Cambridge Analytica and, misinformation by the Russian government. And I think that's important part of kind of the health of those networks, to make sure that that disinformation isn't being spread. So for me, it doesn't really offer a restriction for the kind of work that Bellingcat does, because often we're not using these kind of mass scraping things. It's very unusual we would do that. We're kind of manually looking through social media profiles and looking at every photo and comment, and really digging into who people are and trying to find all these little connections that you can't really get when you like kind of mass scraping data. But obviously, others have found a lot of use for doing that, as kind of Brexit and other things that Cambridge Analytica proved. But I think it is important. I mean, we do a lot of stuff and we're amazed that people put so much stuff on the internet, and we kind of, it's one of the paradoxes where we actually want, the good people to take all their stuff on the internet so the bad people can't use it, but we want the bad people to leave all their stuff on the internet so we can use it and find out stuff about them. So it's always kind of amusing when we move to like a whole new area of investigation where there hasn't been this kind of coverage of our work. Like with Russia and conflict, what's happened there is now Russia's passed a law where soldiers can't post pictures of their service on social media. So because that isn't a direct reaction to what we've been doing with Bellingcat, but other countries aren't like that. We had, for example, a video we investigated in Cameroon of 2 women and 2 children being executed. And we had started working on this and there was some coverage of it. And the Cameroonian government came out and started calling it fake news, which is like, red rag to a bull to us. I mean, you call something we're doing fake news and we're definitely going to look into it. And that went from the Cameroonian government calling it fake news to just a couple of months ago, those soldiers involved being convicted for executing those people. And that was purely based on the open source research we were doing. But I think because they were so unprepared for what we could do, because it wasn't an area we've ever worked on before, and there's no reason for a Cameroonian government official to know what open source investigation is, that when we actually did that stuff, it was very hard for it caught them by surprise. So that's one nice thing about moving into different areas of investigation, is you get to catch people by surprise.
Yeah, and speaking of surprising people with your investigations, we have one question from our audience here that says, so if you explain how you investigate, isn't there a risk that criminals will avoid to post images that can give hints? How do you deal with this? Like people knowing how you investigate and trying to hide the hints and the way that can give you some tips to investigate.
It's again, this is kind of another paradox of what we do. We have to be transparent about what we do to kind of make the case of what we're saying isn't just us giving you our opinion, but it's based off, examining these images very carefully. And how we came to those conclusions. So by that process itself, we're telling people how to do what we're doing. But also we want as many people as possible doing this work, because there's a very small open source investigation community as it is. And the more people who do it, the better, basically, because you can cover a lot more ground, like we did with the Europol investigation. So we found so far the balance between sharing what we do and how we do it has far outweighed the kind of negative reaction to it. And there's so much you can investigate as well. It's not, we can go all over the world and investigate stuff. It's not just limited to what we can investigate in one country or another. Even though our focus has often been on Syria and Russia, that's more because of how the kind of community has evolved and the topics that were kind of the hot topics at the time it was evolving and what was producing the most open source material. But you can apply these techniques to anywhere in the world, and there's a huge amount of untapped kind of areas of investigation. And really it's been very much focused on Ukraine, Syria and Russia as the main kind of areas of investigation. But you go anywhere else, and often they, like I said before, they don't have a clue about this. So you can kind of catch them unawares until they spend 2 or 3 years trying to catch up with what you're actually doing, by which time you've done plenty of work.
Yeah, and speaking of these negative reactions to your work, you've been regularly attacked by Russian hackers and trolls. And how can we ensure the safety of journalists and activists like you who are conducting this kind of open source investigations to report on human rights violations?
I mean, it can be a bit tricky because, I mean, we've just recently, for example, revealed Russia's secret chemical weapons program to the world. And obviously that upsets Russia quite a bit. And this chemical weapons program is being used to assassinate Russia's critics abroad. So, that's quite on the nose for, the risks it presents us. And Russia knows what we're doing, and we're transparent, so they don't know how we're doing it. But I mean, for us, there's the kind of cybersecurity side of things, which is really just about locking stuff down, using two-step verification and YubiKeys and that kind of things to be really secure online as much as you can be. Then there's kind of more the physical security side of it. And we kind of have the philosophy that may or may not be correct, but it's our best one, that the kind of more high profile we are, the more obvious a target we are, the kind of more, in a way, protected we are. Because if I stub my toe, people will assume it's Russia behind it at this point, because people know Russia hates me so much. So it's probably the only real protection we have, is rather than kind of hiding our identities and, not showing who we are, is just make ourselves as high profile as possible, because in a way that makes us a more difficult target to attack. I mean, it doesn't make us indestructible, but, given the balance of all the equations, we've kind of come up with that as the best way.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the tools and the techniques that you use for your cybersecurity. I would love to go a little bit further on this, because I think this is so important for so many journalists here. And I wonder if you could share more tips on how to protect ourselves in the digital space.
I mean, for one thing, use something like Signal for your communications. When instead of just a text messaging app or normal phone app on your phone, use Signal, because that's one of the most secure options you're going to have, and that will put off quite a lot of actors trying to access your information. Some really dumb basic stuff you can do is like go back through your Twitter direct messages and delete them, because it does not automatically delete your Twitter direct messages. So if you get hacked, you'll have your entire life of Twitter direct messages just there for anyone to go through and read. Same with Facebook direct messages and on other social media platforms. Just don't think because you've typed something and forgotten about it that it's just going to disappear. It's just still there forever. We've started moving into using the kind of security keys, the physical security keys to plug into our computers that, Google supports very well, for example, the Titan key there, other kinds of things like that. That is probably the best protection you're going to get. But two-step verification on everything is basically a must in this day and age. It's mad that you wouldn't even consider doing that. And don't use SMS verification either, because that is something that's probably one of the weakest forms of two-step verification. Use an authenticator app or something like that. So for cybersecurity, I mean, those are steps that everyone can take. They're quite simple to take. Two-step verification should be the easiest thing. You can go off and set that up now, and I'd highly recommend it to everyone. But that's a really, really good start. And then, beyond that, get a VPN and use that whenever you can. But that if you don't do the basics, you're gonna be targeted. And don't feel bad that journalists don't do this. I mean, we've been looking into Russian spies who literally are getting hacked in the most simplest ways possible, because they have the most obvious passwords with no two-step verification. And these are professional spies working for the GRU and FSB, and they get caught out like this multiple times, even after other spies have been outed as having their stuff hacked. They still don't put on two-step verification. It's handy for the people who are hacking them, which can be useful for us when that information tells us in our hands. But it amazes me how kind of dumb they are about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and you were mentioning spies and intelligence agencies, and I wonder how you deal with intelligence agencies, and we have some questions around it from our audience. So I think that the theme of open source research is of great interest of governments and law enforcement organisms. So have government intelligence agencies contacted you, and do you have to deal with some sort of demand coming from them?
We're not kind of contacted by them. I mean, probably if we're contacted by anyone working in intelligence, it would be police intelligence in relation to crimes that we've kind of written about. So, you know, on a kind of small level, like the Europol stuff, we have their kind of intelligence division working on child abuse claims coming towards us and asking us questions. We've done a lot, for example, on the Berlin bicycle assassination case, where a dissident was assassinated, and we identified the assassin as an FSB officer, but connected to the FSB, the Russian intelligence service, and a whole load of information. And there we were asked to basically present evidence to the investigation. And that was kind of taken up to a very high level because we had unique information that now that this case has gone to trial, the German intelligence services apparently didn't have this information. So it's clear in some cases we're finding stuff that the intelligence service are not finding themselves, and that's when, you know, we're dealing with chemical weapons and stuff like that. That obviously we become interesting to them. You know, I've had kind of police intelligence come to me to basically give me a talk about my security as well. You know, and let me know that if they hear anything, I'll hear about it and they'll look after my security. So it's more on a kind of security side of things, and us kind of, if any information is going anyway, it's generally information we found, you know, going to police or something like that for them to use. And some of the stuff we're working on, I mean, the thing I mentioned before, the chemical weapons factory, that's a massive, massive deal. That shows that Russia's violating the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is a huge issue for you know, a lot of intelligence services across the world. But generally, you know, if we're approached by like a police saying, can you share information with us, you know, we'll do what we can, because it's open source evidence. So we aren't saying this witness told us this thing and now we're telling you. It's like, here's the web page it's on, go and look at it yourself. And with the investigation into the shooting down of MH17, a lot of what we were giving the police was literally just stuff they could have found on the internet themselves. But we wanted to, before we publish stuff, give official investigations a chance to look at it, so because otherwise it'll get taken off the internet, and then we've effectively destroyed evidence by publicizing it. So it gives them the chance to record that information themselves in the way they need to do it for evidence for the case they're doing. And I think often this is a problem that people don't realize when they're doing this kind of investigations into something criminal, that the act of exposing a criminal's social media page gets it shut down very quickly by the criminal in question, and then the police who might be investigating it aren't going to be very happy with you that you've basically destroyed a bunch of evidence they could have used. So you kind of have to be quite cautious when you're exposing certain kinds of people. And I think it's, if you're talking as a journalist, it can be quite difficult to say, well, how do you engage with law enforcement? But at the same time, you don't want to be in a position where you're literally interfering with criminal investigations into stuff that can be extremely serious crimes. You know, we've looked into assassinations, murders, child abuse, all kinds of stuff, and we would never want to negatively impact the actual investigations into that, because we don't go around arresting people.
And how do you draw the line? Because I've seen some serious investigations coming from Bellingcat's work. So how do you draw the line, and when do you feel like it's not your responsibility, or it's not on your payroll to do this kind of investigation?
Well, I mean, I think there's two questions there. One is really the, you know, responsibility of, you know, where do we, I think if there's ever anything in an investigation where there's criminal act, we will try and communicate that to whichever authorities need to take action on it. If they don't take action on it, then we'll publish anyway, because, you know, if they aren't interested in something like that, then, you know, we can't force them to investigate things. But fortunately, because of our reputation, generally that's not something that's a problem. But then it's kind of what we choose to investigate. I mean, that becomes more and more difficult, because Bellingcat initially was nearly all volunteers, so it's really driven by what the volunteers were interested in. And most of us were interested in MH17 being shot down, which became one of our first big investigations, and then that led us to finding stuff about Russia's involvement in the conflict in Ukraine, and that kind of then branched off with the volunteers looking into stuff like that. And I like to let people write about what they want, because it gives them a chance to, you know, they get passionate about it, they care about it, they really dig into stuff. And that's important when you're digging through, you know, 10,000 web pages to find one photograph. But as Bellingcat has grown and we've become a more professional organization, we've gone from kind of me doing everything as the only paid employee to having like 18 staff members and office in the Netherlands, you know, we've got like a foundation status and all kinds of, you know, a proper organization now. It means that we kind of have to be a bit more strategic about where we're focusing. And we have kind of broader strategic goals, kind of, you know, raising awareness of open source investigation, taking it to different regions of the world where it hasn't been done before, developing ideas around justice and accountability in those processes. So now when we think, what are we going to investigate? We're kind of saying, okay, does it tick these boxes in this kind of, you know, our goals basically? And if it does, then and it's funded properly, which is always a problem as well with this kind of work, then we're able to do that. But if it doesn't really meet the criteria of what we're looking into, then it doesn't. But generally, because we're looking at stuff quite broadly still, there's still plenty of room for our investigators to choose what they're going to investigate. It just, we know now that it adds to the organization and the kind of entire field of open source investigation. If we kind of focus on certain areas, and our investigators understand that as well. So far it's working as a, you know, it's a good system so far. It hasn't failed as yet.
Yeah, you mentioned sometimes the work of the volunteers, and I'd like to know a little bit more now how you are structuring this community now in this new phase of Bellingcat. What is the importance of this community that you created and the crowdsourcing work?
I mean, it's still very important to us. It's kind of like, in a way, you kind of have like almost like an onion. So right in the middle, you have the first layer, which is the Bellingcat investigation team. So that kind of has kind of historically been volunteers, but we've kind of been increasingly hiring people from that community. Then kind of the next layer is probably the very engaged Bellingcat kind of contributors who might not be part of the investigation team, but they're people we can always go to with questions. And often they're kind of chemical weapons experts or people who focus on a specific field. Then outside of that, you have the kind of very engaged internet community that's around Bellingcat. So from there, you'll have people who are, will look at very specific things. Like there's a great community who are doing the geolocation of those Russian airstrikes, for example. That would be those kind of peoples. Then you have the kind of broader Bellingcat community who follow us, and they might pick up on stuff, but they're not really super engaged. And then the kind of wider world they're connected to kind of on social media. But that kind of wider world can engage with the Europol type projects more easily, because it's a very simple task. You're saying, do you know what this object is? But it's a question that works better if you ask as many people as possible, because you're looking at asking for people anywhere in the world, do you know what this is? But at that core, you have the investigation team, and they do the really complex stuff. And I found that if you try and give lots of people a complex investigation, you end up with disaster. You end up with things like the infamous Reddit Boston Marathon bombing, where they're investigating it in a Reddit community of hundreds, if not thousands of people, and they identify the wrong people because it was created this kind of groupthink where kind of key information wasn't challenged, or if it was ignored because people had focused on something else, you know, in error. So by having a big community but keeping it simple, that can be very good. So what our next stage of Bellingcat's development is we're going to create a volunteer section for our website where we can kind of list kind of videos and photographs and other bits of information we're trying to find out more stuff on the geolocation, and have the volunteers being able to focus their efforts there. And we're going to work with an organization called Mnemonic, formerly known as the Syrian Archive, who have been archiving videos from conflict zones and have literally millions of videos that need to be geolocated. And part of that, a kind of steady stream of information and videos to the volunteer section will be about geolocating those videos. So we can create a geolocated data set of literally millions of, you know, videos from conflict zones that can be used by investigators to understand these conflicts better. Because otherwise you just end up with a million videos with no metadata that no one can use because they just don't have any way of searching them.
Mm-hmm. And going to change the subject a little bit to talk about disinformation and the level of sophistication that we've seen in the most recent disinformation waves. So we've seen videos with deep fakes arriving with more force and it starts to become more and more important to verify their origin. So are there any open tools or techniques or technologies to help us separate what is real from what is manufactured in this sense?
There's not too many. Microsoft has been kind of doing some work on this, and they have some tools that aren't public yet. But I think often, which is really overlooked with disinformation, is very much you don't think about the communities as sharing this disinformation. And if you do think about them, you just think about them as kind of victims of the disinformation. But more often than not, you're actually dealing with people who are true believers in certain things. I mean, you kind of I encounter a lot of these communities a lot of times. For example, with MH17, you kind of have this MH17 truther community where Russia's completely innocent, Ukraine did it, and they have a whole community of websites and blogs who kind of create a media ecosystem. It's the same with the White Helmets in Syria, the rescue team, the Syrian civil defense there. There's a whole community of people who hate them and believe they're literally a CIA conspiracy to, overthrow the Assad government by recording stuff on the ground, which is all fake anyway. And there's a community around that of websites, blogs, personalities. What's a bit unusual about that is you have Russia amplifying members of that community, but it's like many other open communities on the internet. They believe something very strongly. Often they have a distrust of authority, so they are more vulnerable to receiving disinformation, but they create a lot of this disinformation themselves, and that is then amplified within the community. And you can have more extreme examples of that. The flat earth community, for example, anyone would say that's completely insane. The earth is round, everyone knows that. But the flat earth community, the kind of how it's constructed, the way they work, the way they think is pretty much identical to communities who focus on other topics, the kind of MH17 truthers, the white helmets haters. They have personalities. They have people who record videos on YouTube and get 10 million views, and it exists there. It exists with every kind of community where you've kind of been filtered. You've found something that's interesting, and thanks to algorithms telling you which YouTube video to watch next, you watch more and more videos that are into the thing you're interested in. You become more and more convinced. You get drawn into these communities, and then if you're someone who spends a lot of the time on the internet, and you kind of your social circle ends up being mostly online, you start basing your value on that. And then you start distrusting authority. You say, well, I can't trust the government to tell me the truth about Syria or the shape of the earth or whether or not drinking bleach is a good idea medically. And you start then just completely disbelieving everything and reinforcing that. And it basically turns everyone into an extremist of one sort or another. I mean, when you talk about online radicalization, very often you're thinking about Islamists, but it happens to everyone on pretty much every topic, or nearly everyone. You just get really into a certain topic, you just become part of that community, and then all of a sudden you're kind of on YouTube or you're out on the street screaming about wearing a mask or not wearing a mask or saying coronavirus is fake. It happens time and time again. And when we talk about disinformation, we so often see it as something external being put into a community, but often it's being generated by those communities. And those communities can be manipulated by fake information. But more often than not, it's just what they truly believe. They aren't lying on purpose. They think, well, this is the truth. And they think you're the one who's lying. And this is a really big problem with the internet. And the internet is designed perfectly to create these communities, because you have social media sites with algorithms pointing you to people who think just like you. And if you fall out with them because they don't think just exactly like you, you find another community that does think exactly like you. And they're from all over the world, and there's thousands of them, whatever the topic is. And what's really scary is more and more now you're seeing these separate communities kind of being drawn together, because often the sites that deal with the kind of conspiracy theories on one topic will start dealing with it on another topic. Like I've seen a lot of the kind of white helmets, kind of anti-white helmets people, the white helmets truthers, getting into coronavirus conspiracy theories. So you then get the kind of health conspiracy theory community being drawn into the anti-white helmets conspiracy communities discourse. So I know it's not at all, but I think it's a really important thing that is always to overlook about disinformation. That it's just not always something that's coming from external sources to impact a community. It is a community impacting external sources.
Yeah, we are all trapped in our filter bubbles and our own biases, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and moving to a different topic, I was curious when you mentioned in your presentation some obscure websites to track marine routes, air routes. How do you come up with this site? How do you discover this kind of obscure websites to use in your investigations?
I mean, often, again, it all comes down to being part of the community. That, when you're online a lot, as I often am, and you're on Twitter and you see something come up, you might see someone mention a site you've never seen before. And when you're kind of really involved with the open source community and you're online a lot, that's what people find. They find new tools and they share it on Twitter and you see it, or they might show you some clever thing they've done using marine traffic, for example, to track vessels in a very particular instance. For example, when Iran was being accused of attacking these various oil tankers, you could track the oil tankers and you could see the moment they stopped dead in the water when they were attacked. And lots of people were sharing that, and that raises awareness of that kind of tool. So often it's worth having these conversations about these tools online just to raise awareness of them, because one thing I like about the open source community is generally everyone wants to share everything with each other, because the more people who do this stuff, the more stuff that you'll find out about the world. And that's what I think a lot of open source investigators want to do. They want a better understanding of the world around them. And that's certainly what drove me. So by being part of a community that happily shares information and the tools, you just benefit from that, because you share something and someone else shares something, and before you know it, loads and loads of things.
Yeah, we have a very strong community of data journalists here, and I think most of them are with us in this conference, following the panels. And I'd like to ask you some tips for this community to start digging into this kind of open source investigations. How can we start? And what are the main tips that you can give us to create from this community that we already have a community around OSINT?
I often advise people the best thing to do is just start trying to do something simple. Don't think you have to start with big investigations like Bellingcat does with lots of videos and stuff like that. Just geolocating one video that interests you, even if it might not have an impact on the wider world, it might not cause a revolution. Just something that's interesting. Like if you see, a video, like we've had lots of kind of Black Lives Matters protests in the US, and we started looking at the police videos there. We started geolocating them on social media just one by one, and people started joining in. Then you'd be able to create a data set from that of these geolocated videos, which we've now actually gone and published with an organization called Forensic Architecture. But just find something that you're interested in and just try and geolocate it. Something as simple as that. And then that makes you think about the process of what you're doing. And then if you have a community like you already have, you can start saying, okay, well, this topic is particularly interesting. We've got like 10 people who want to kind of geolocate these videos and place them in a location and start building a timeline from that. Start building small. It's like you have a toolbox available to you, but you aren't expected to build a house the first time you get handed a toolbox. Look at the screwdriver first and sit the screws in, and then you can build from there. But over time, you'll learn new skills. You learn different ways of doing things. So when you look at a big problem, you'll know from experience that this is the kind of flow chart of what you need to do to make it an effective investigation, and what tools you need to do to move it along, and if you get stuck in this area, where you can go to next.
And since this community is very used to do investigations with data, I wonder if you could share what is the level of use of how data-driven your investigations are, and what kind of techniques we can import from what we've already been doing with data for stories.
It's hard to talk it in the terms of data, because you're often dealing with, you might be looking into an individual incident, and you're looking basically at every social media post you can find, every video, every photograph, every witness statement from every source, and then kind of combining it to have an understanding of what happened based off those sources. And sometimes you do find contradictions, but that's kind of not like churning through a massive amount of data, in the sense you might have like a big database. It's like literally just digging manually through social media. And I think that's the kind of real, in a way, I think maybe one of the differences between the two different kinds of investigations. Open source investigation is often a very manual process, and it can seem tedious to some people when they're looking at it, that you're looking through hundreds of photographs on the social media websites looking for one photograph. But when you find that one photograph, it's very exciting. But, we are moving more into kind of using large data sets. We've been acquiring a lot of data, leaked databases from Russia of things like telephone registrations, house registrations, car registrations. And sometimes it's about turning that data into something that's searchable in a way that's actually useful to other researchers. And I think when you start becoming part of a community, sometimes you create something to serve another community or another group of people in that community. And that can be actually very empowering for them and bring them to find more investigations. And I think maybe one of the best pieces of advice I can give, and this is something that's worked well with us, is talk to people who aren't necessarily in the same community as you are, because you often find you might have common interests but kind of different ways of approaching problems. And we often do a lot of collaborative projects where we'll work with 4 or 5 organizations with different specializations and different focuses, but we all share the data that we have, and then we're able to produce kind of different products at the end of it, but they're all based off the same verified information. So I think reaching out and kind of talking to people you might not always talk to is always a good idea.
And you also mentioned that you were working in a new data set. You were building a new data set around images. How does it work for you when you need a data set that it's not available? Do you usually use your community or crowdsource the work in order to structure the data and use it to different kind of investigations?
It depends. It's like when we were doing the one for the airstrikes, the Russian airstrikes that were being geolocated. That was something that was kind of being done on a kind of ad hoc basis on Twitter, but we realized that was something that could be quite structured, because it's basically, a simple question: where was this filmed? Is it where Russia claims it was filmed? Yes or no? Where, those kind of details that could then be structured and then turned into kind of different visualizations as well. I think sometimes as well with open source investigation, it's about recognizing where there are patterns that you can kind of record in that way, rather than it being a kind of chaotic mass of social media posts. Actually, it's something that's quite systematic, recognizing that and then turning that into data sets that then can be used in different ways. Now, we certainly aren't people who deal with data visualization much, and it's something we're trying to get into a lot more. But we've created a lot of information that's often very can be used in a whole variety of different ways. And then that starts moving into now, kind of the work of forensic architecture, who we partner with a lot, is using machine learning to basically automatically detect vehicles and weapons in videos. So if you do have 1 million videos from a place like Syria, rather than having to watch every single one to find the different weapons in them, it will find the most likely videos with those in them. So that kind of treatment of those kind of visual data now for us is very important, because there is so much of this information that does come from conflict zones, and it's becoming such an important part of evidence in kind of war crimes tribunals and other kind of justice and accountabilities. Sometimes you just don't have a chance to look through 1 million videos looking for the right one when you're looking for, like, this kind of bomb or this kind of weapon. And having kind of machine learning, being able to look for those data sets and turn it into useful data, is extremely important.
Yeah, I'd like to learn more from you about the use of machine learning in your investigations. How likely you use it? How many times do you use this kind of technique, artificial intelligence, to dig into the data sets that you have?
It's something that's very new for us, because it is so specialized. I mean, because Bellingcat was mostly a volunteer organization, and we've kind of grown up from, just me as the only full-time employee. Find the right project for that's been quite difficult, but we are moving into a couple of projects. Like I said, we've got this massive data set of Russian data that's on, unfortunately, Russian databases that are in different formats and, just nightmarish to deal with. But if we could get them all talking to each other, they would basically have like an automatic detection machine for Russian spies, which would be hugely useful for the kind of work we're doing. And not only that, it would tell us where they've been and all kinds of fun details about them. So one thing that's very good about, well, bad for them, good for us, is when they're doing these kind of creating these fake identities, for example, they actually do it in a fairly systematic kind of way. They use the same kind of tricks when they're making the fake IDs, like using the same date of birth or the same birthplace or the same first or second name. So we've realized that's a pattern of behavior, but to find one requires you to dig through loads of different databases from all over Russia. It's quite time consuming, but that's the kind of thing that could be automated quite easily, just to give you throw out a list of the kind of matches where there's people with mysteriously the same date of birth and place of birth, and point you to likely matches of what you're looking for, and then give us a chance to dig through it a lot more. But it's that kind of, when you have that massive data, it's literally terabytes of databases, that's the kind of thing that can be hugely powerful. And it can create more investigative leads as well, because we know we've detected, literally dozens of Russian spies doing this manually. And I'm sure there's plenty more of them out there that we've not come across yet, just because we haven't looked in the right place yet.
Yeah, I was checking here if we have any other question from our audience. I think I've asked you all that we had. So, and we are reaching the final minutes here. So I'd like to ask you to give you the floor to make your final considerations, or, bring some specific message to the Brazilian audience. I've heard that you have the intention to create more content in Portuguese. So how are your plans in this regard? Like, how do you see the future of Bellingcat in Brazil or other Portuguese-speaking countries?
Well, one thing we're trying to do with Bellingcat is move into kind of different areas. And we've been working actually a lot with groups in Latin America already. We've done quite a lot of work in Venezuela and Colombia and elsewhere. Obviously, that's Spanish speaking. So we'd like to move into Brazil, which is obviously a huge area. I would say to people listening, don't be afraid to be the first person to be a really good open source investigator in the Portuguese language, because there's none I really know of yet. So, you've got this kind of virgin territory for you to explore. It's great. And I think, for us as well with Bellingcat, it's not just about the regions of the world, but the kind of topics we're looking into. We've been, talking to people recently about expanding into conservation issues, looking at deforestation, the illegal trade in animals, even mahogany and stuff like that. That's a completely untapped area. Yeah, I think especially in Brazil, that's a huge issue. You could probably do some really amazing investigative work just using open sources, looking at, for example, logging and the impact it has on local areas, and how, measuring that impact in different ways that might not be obvious in more traditional kind of investigations. So I would say to anyone, if you want to, be the best Portuguese speaking open source investigator in the world, then there's not much competition at the moment. So if you get a head start now, you could do great things.
Okay, huge opportunity here for the folks in the audience. Okay, Elliot, I'd like to thank you so much for being with us. It's a great honor, as I said. And I think this conversation, at least for me, was very inspiring. And I think for our audience, it's probably also a good start to dig into OSINT and all the tools that you and the guys from Bellingcat make available for us. So thank you so much. And yes, obrigada para todos vocês que estão aqui acompanhando com a gente. Bom, acho que nossa sessão está chegando ao fim. Não sei se a gente tem algum aviso aí do pessoal do Coda para fazer, mas se não tiver, então a gente pode encerrar. Obrigada, pessoal.